Hi, everybody. My name is Julia Anderson, and I'm going to be talking about the ethics of conversational AI today. I know you all understand that AI has its fair share of challenges, and today I'm going to be talking about how that relates to the challenges of voice technology and how people interact with it. I come from a design and multidisciplinary background, so I'm going to be focusing on a user-centric approach, but also we'll discuss what this looks like from an organizational standpoint towards the last half of the presentation. Today, we're going to be covering a few topics. First, I'm going to be talking about what conversational AI is. Second, going into the ethical concerns surrounding it, what it looks like in practice, meaning what do businesses really consider when deploying and designing these technologies? What sorts of use cases are around and to come? And finally, what's next in the conversational AI space? Conversational AI is, in simple terms, a technology that uses a natural language interface to communicate. When we think of conversational AI, typically chatbots or voice assistants come to mind, and I'll be talking about those as well as a few other technologies today. And here I also have a few questions that I pose to consider how having a natural language interface affects the user experience amongst various consumer and enterprise devices and products. One thing I do want to note is that language is our oldest interface. With that in mind, how does this change our relationship with technology when we use it as a medium of communication? What else is communicated through shared language? I'll be talking a little bit about sentiment analysis today, which is determining other factors of communication besides the actual words or content that's there. So thinking about what emotions are underlying it, what sorts of intentions as well. And finally, a much more ethical questions. Do humans trust talking machines? This could depend on different thresholds of trust people have, whether that's towards chatbots or voice assistants and kind of their perceptions around it. So these are all questions that kind of in a broad sense are what conversational AI is about, but also questions that one should consider when designing a new product that uses this technology or perhaps innovates a product that is starting to use these elements. There's a few causes for concern that I will be talking about here. The main thing to remember is that conversational AI tends to interact with people in private settings. This could be their homes with smart devices or voice assistants. This could also mean in a car, or perhaps even more private, a care setting in the healthcare space. And this is just a few of many use cases that could arise. Because this technology interacts with people in private settings, data privacy or the fear of surveillance is a considerable topic and concern. Not only do we have the fact that people are talking to machines in these settings, but also the curiosity or concern that people have with how their data is used. Particularly, they become more aware of it when you're actually using your voice to talk to these devices. Bias is a second important concern. And when I say bias, I don't necessarily only mean the lack of training data, but also bias when it comes to accessibility and being able to determine what technology can understand when it comes to people with accents or different ways of speaking. There's also the concern, and this is almost more of a UX concern, is localization, meaning what do people sound like when they're in different regions? How is the technology accustomed to responding in these different contexts? Finally, there is the issue of interoperability. Essentially, this means that interoperability is the idea of being able to interact with various devices that perhaps might be using different protocols or are made by different manufacturers at the same time. And there are some regulations around this, and there are other use cases that surround this as well. For example, having one chatbot that is in a particular expertise hand off to some other chatbot that is perhaps more well suited. So these are a little bit more technical concerns, but still have to do with a lot of privacy issues and way that information is being shared. A main concern for people that I alluded to in the previous slide is what happens to your voice. People are very personal about how they sound like. It's one thing to be writing a message on your phone. It's another to really hear someone's voice. It's a lot more unique, perhaps a little bit more emotional for some people. And because of this, people want to know if and when devices are listening to them. People like transparency and privacy. There is a shift in the voice industry to use on-device processing, which is something that Siri actually uses. And this is something where what is being said to a voice assistant is not redirected to a cloud, but rather responded to or analyzed on the device, which saves some time and speed for the user, but also assures them that their data or their voice is not being sent to this cloud that they don't know about, and makes them a little more reassured of what is or how these devices are being used. Another way that people are more comfortable with having their voice be used is the ability to delete voice recordings. Sometimes companies will use data from customers to train the devices or the products based kind of what's like a data gathering and language training situation. But as long as people know that they're able to delete these recordings, then perhaps they will be more trustworthy of certain devices and understand and maybe satisfy their curiosity of what purpose all their data really serves. Second point here, sentiment analysis. Something that I thought was really fascinating is that Amazon actually has a patent for voice-based determination of physical and emotional characteristics. And this is fascinating technology, being able to determine what people mean apart from the actual words themselves is something of more of greater intelligence. It's something that you and I consider when we talk to other people. It's not just what they say, how they say it. So this is really groundbreaking in ways, but also there's been concerns about having this sort of technology being used by law enforcement or having the technology not work as accurately as it might hope and thereby gather incorrect assumptions about people, and maybe what one culture considers angry in tone of voice is actually joy or surprise in another, and that could start to blend some incorrect stereotypes perhaps about what voice or what message is being delivered. Finally, Who am I speaking to? This is a little bit more important when it comes to IVR. So whenever you pick up the phone, maybe you're calling customer service, do people prefer to speak to a human? Do people know that they're speaking to a human or a robot when they pick up the phone? Does it matter? Sometimes people just want to get their answers quickly as possible. They don't really care. But then there's the question of, should we be having a disclosure or disclaimer before so people know that they're talking to a robot versus a person? Also, another thing to consider from a business sense is it better for certain things to be used by or responded to by a human or a robot? The one thing that comes to mind is in healthcare. To what extent should a bot be giving medical advice or simply assisting someone through a tedious process? This is an ethical concern and also a business one. This is going to have to require a few things for business and market research as well to understand what needs you are truly serving. Technology moves faster than regulation. I think a lot of us know this. We do have a few policies or laws in place that go into protecting data privacy rights, and CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act, and Europe's General Data Protection Regulation are two important ones. However, they are hardly universal. These rules are not unique to voice interfaces and AI, which may use data differently than other technologies. Nowadays, many companies ask for explicit consent to collect data when you land on their website. And this is a push towards opt-in data collection, which preserves personal information before it's shared. However, this kind of explicit consent is not common practice in conversational AI. And that's one thing that it's kind of important to note when you consider how users are perceiving this technology. So I really love this quote about having conversational AI, whether that's a bot or a voice assistant, be the face, or I guess the voice of some company. This quote goes into the bias about economics, language, education, and race. And this is just to name a few. As I mentioned before, there's also the considerations of localization. How do people phrase things or say things in other regions or dialects is another important consideration. Second, accessibility. When people can't understand a voice assistant, or rather the other way around, when a voice assistant or bot can't understand someone based on their accent or perhaps a speech impediment, that becomes an issue for the user. They don't feel like they can trust the device perhaps, or they can't really accomplish what they're here to do. So they use another means, another channel, when in fact this could be the best first impression instead. Conversational AI should be sustainable for companies and compatible for consumers. When I say sustainable, I mean that companies, businesses should build AI systems that are able to scale while minimizing costs to consumers, society, and the environment. Compatible, meaning that you're making sure that this technology is reaching them in a way that they are comfortable with, not only from data privacy or trust capacity, but reaching them where they are and doing that market and user research. I'm sure a lot of you know how much collaboration it takes to demonstrate the vision and governance of AI products. That's really the first step. If conversational AI is an offering, then you need to be meeting with various stakeholders to understand what cultural and technological shifts are necessary to get you there. Second, and arguably this could also be the first step, depending on what sort of user-centric or business-centric approach you're taking, what do users need? What customer complexities are we solving? For example, it might just be easier to build a frequently asked questions section on a website than building an entire chatbot. Another important consideration is not only what your customers are thinking, but what about your employees? They're also going to be using this product or supporting it somehow. So do they understand that this conversational AI is meant to augment their role rather than replace them? That is obviously a contentious topic these days with the reach of bots and the labor market. So really making sure that is set from the beginning can help save the company, your company, or your users a lot of stress down the line. Third, we want to understand what data is necessary for a minimum viable product, or in this case, minimum viable conversation. Depending on whether you're using a chatbot or a voice assistant, you're going to have different training models and time horizons. Also, for enterprise solutions, you must understand that there's several pieces of a platform that create that end experience. It could be a mesh of NLP, backend integration, data storage, and more. And knowing what you need can determine the answer to the big question: do you want to buy or kind of outsource some of this work to a different platform, or do you want to build it yourself? Because you also have to know, if you start choosing a few different platforms, are they going to be able to talk to each other in the data sense? So it's really kind of being strategic around that. And there will be people who in your organization that are, of course, more specialized in this to better understand the technical limitations. Finally, iterate, iterate, iterate. Iteration is part of a design process. It should also be part of a business process. People need to realize that AI is not a plug and play situation with immediate returns. And you also need to understand and listen to what customers are saying, in this case, literally, especially when it comes to multimodal devices and third-party applications. There will always be new technology to stretch the limits, and you need to be ready and hopefully nimble enough to have these offerings in place and ready to take up. All that to say, you should be treating conversational AI as an investment in your customer support channels, perhaps, or just other types of product goals. And that all just needs to be laid out in the beginning, or else you're going to have this supposed solution that never gets updated or is not really seen as valuable by the company or who you're working with, because that was never truly understood from the beginning. Prioritizing collaboration over speed is a huge factor definitely in the design process, but also particularly for conversational AI, because conversational AI is inherently multidisciplinary. It uses language, it uses product, it has more kind of unique technological considerations compared to graphical interfaces, which could also be part of the rollout of this AI. You could always have multimodal devices where you have the conversational AI that also uses a screen. So basically, you need to be prioritizing working with different stakeholders rather than being the first or trying to deploy something as fast as possible. Because in the end, this is still an emerging technology and it will get faster in that sense, but you need a steady foundation to begin with. And with that, hopefully your AI will become a nimble solution in the long run. I brought up this issue of interoperability. And one way that this is being solved or assisted is through this protocol called Matter. And Matter is simplifying development for manufacturers while increasing compatibility for consumers. This started out as it's called Project Chip, Connected Home over IP in 2019, and has since been a collaboration by some of the biggest tech companies in the conversational AI space, and are also the main goal here is to create a unified smart home standard. Since on one hand, this makes it easier for manufacturers to build with confidence. They know that what they can build is using this protocol that other brands can kind of go off of, especially when you think of a smart home, you are gonna probably end up buying multiple different brands of products. And then from a consumer sense, you ideally would just kind of be able to pick up 2 different smart home products from 2 different brands. And as long as they both had this Matter symbol on it, then you would know it's compatible. This is one way that we are, as an industry, solving this issue of interoperability. And I'm sure more of this and more of the reach of the Matter protocol will be seen in the coming years. Conversational AI also enhances other interfaces. As I mentioned, the idea of multimodality is becoming much more popular. Here, I have a few items that conversational AI is kind of touching as an industry beyond chatbots and phones, which is the traditional perception of where conversational AI is. Transportation and logistics. There's conversational AI in warehouses and in cars that are kind of able to take inventory and stock and also navigate and interact with people in their automobiles. Smart cities is a really fascinating use case. There would obviously be a lot of potential issues around surveillance that already exists today outside of conversational AI, and also understanding kind of how devices across an urban landscape perhaps are interacting or talking to people is another consideration. The AR and VR space is ripe with opportunity, as many of you know. IoT, Internet of Things, this is more alluding to a little bit more of that smart home capability that I talked about with Matter. Moderation is a really fascinating use case. This is in the sense of, say you are in an online forum and you are able to detect kind of aggression or abuse. This is also used in the gaming industry. Perhaps there is a way, and some companies are already exploring this, to know when a child is talking in during a game that is meant for only adults, and kind of flagging that, making sure they're not in this environment that they shouldn't be in. And finally, I think the grand goal, or the kind of in the future goal, is really to incorporate this type of technology into social robotics and really having this machine that can talk to you either like a friend or maybe in more of a care setting. And there are places that are already exploring this. LEQ is one that is being used as almost a kind of smart voice assistant for the elderly specifically, or for older adults. And this is a really interesting way that we are bridging the gap between how humans communicate with technology. Wherever you talk is an opportunity for conversational AI. Here I have this kind of periodic table of AI elements from OneReach AI that goes into a lot of ways that bots can automate certain processes, but also use this natural language approach to make it more human, more helpful and personal for a lot of people. And that's really the goal here of conversational AI, to make it so things feel more personal, perhaps are easier to navigate than a graphical interface or alongside a graphical interface, and to kind of span the reach of what we typically think of as kind of interactive experience. Going forward, there's going to be more research and more opportunities to see how voice technology is integrated in the larger consumer product space, and even in businesses as well. And so I wanted to share kind of as my last little piece of advice is to check out Open Voice Network. They are doing some incredible work with creating voice guidelines. And these 3 things here are recommendations they made from their white paper about privacy principles and capabilities unique to voice. The first they recommend is that they want to create a privacy policy template that would be used or could be used by enterprises or independent entities to address privacy risks. And this would be almost like a design checklist in a way, understanding how much data you need, ways to approach concerns when people think about surveillance or ways that their data could be shared. Second, proposing privacy standards. This is something that they like to have, which is an open resource of guidelines and action items for all those who are interested to start building platforms and voice technology. Long term, they also would like to establish an overview of regulations in various countries and review and establish this review to incorporate voice assistants in the broader sense of consumer data privacy. And in addition to this, they're also exploring perhaps a certification to know that these new products or companies are in accordance with these values and guidelines. I'd love to continue the conversation here. And again, sorry, I cannot be with you all today, but I would love to pick your brains or answer any questions you may have about this sort of technology, this industry, where it's going, and always open to collaboration. So thank you very much, and hope you all learned something new today.